A man calls 911 and says his wife just shot herself. 9 minutes later, he's kneeling beside her body, calm, controlled, using the exact language of the job he spent 30 years doing. Because the man on that call isn't just a husband. He's a police detective. And before the day is over, investigators will start to wonder if he didn't just find the scene, he built it. This is the story of Amy Fanion and a husband who used everything he knew about catching killers to try to become one. It's May 8th, 2018, in Westfield, Massachusetts. Westfield is a kind of town where families don't leave. The same last names show up on Little League rosters, in church bulletins, and on the police force generation after generation. It's tight-knit in a way that only small New England towns really are. Everyone knows everyone, at least a little, and that includes the police. Just after noon, a 911 call comes in. The voice on the line is steady, almost too steady. "Hi, this is Brian Fanion. My wife just shot herself. Can you send help?" The dispatcher tells him help is on the way. Then a pause. "She's gone," he says. "Are you sure?" the dispatcher asks. Yes. Westfield police and fire arrive within minutes. Inside the home, they find 51-year-old Amy Fanion on the dining room floor, a single gunshot wound to the right side of her head. Kneeling beside her is her husband, Brian Fanion, a longtime detective with the Westfield Police Department. The dining room is in disarray. A spent shell casing lies on the floor. Blood spatter marks the window frame between the dining room and the breezeway. Nearby, a pair of glasses carries a reddish-brown residue. The weapon is Brian's own service pistol. At first glance, this looks like an unbearable tragedy. A devoted wife, a gun, a marriage that had quietly come undone. But almost immediately, something feels wrong to the responding investigators. A Massachusetts State Police detective named Brendan Owl is called to the scene, and he later admits that the moment he saw the entry wound, something didn't sit right. It didn't look like a self-inflicted shot. It looked like something else entirely. To understand what was lost that day, you have to understand who Amy was. Amy Jean Hansen was born in 1966, one of 9 children in a Westfield family. The Hansen girls were remembered fondly around town, smart, kind, unassuming. Amy was all of that and more. She volunteered at her church without ever wanting recognition. She simply showed up, did the work, and went home. Her faith wasn't performative. It shaped her daily life. She and Brian attended Wyben Union Church together for years. She loved being outdoors, hiking, kayaking, biking, gardening, not for attention, but because it genuinely brought her peace. The night before she died, she was making a handmade gift for an upcoming baby shower. That same evening, she texted her daughter, Tori, an ordinary conversation, nothing that hinted at what was coming. Prosecutor Mary Sandstrom, who would later handle the case, described Amy simply. She sounded like a fairy tale, giving, selfless, completely devoted to her family. And critically, Sandstrom added, she wasn't ready to die. Amy was healthy. She was happy. She had absolutely no idea that the man she'd built her entire adult life around had already begun planning a future without her. Amy met Brian Fanion in 1983. She was 16, he was 19, both students at Westfield High School. In 1985, they married. Brian came from a family with deep roots in Westfield law enforcement. For him, joining the police department wasn't really a decision. It was closer to an inheritance. He rose steadily through the ranks and eventually made detective. By the time Amy died, he was a well-known, respected figure in town. As one local reporter later put it, there wasn't anyone who spent real time in Westfield who didn't know who Brian Fanion was. They had 2 children, Travis and Tori, and by every outward measure, theirs was a stable, respected family. The kind other couples looked up to, 33 years of marriage, a historic 200-year-old home. And behind the walls of that home, a version of Brian that almost no one on the outside ever saw. Hours after the shooting, investigators bring Brian in for a formal interview at the state police barracks. He's calm, coherent, which, of course, makes sense. He spent his entire career sitting on the other side of interviews just like this one. He tells detectives he left work around 11:45 that morning, while Amy was heading home to make lunch, butter and jelly sandwiches. He specifies. He says a disagreement from a night before resurfaced almost immediately. They've been arguing about his upcoming retirement. He didn't want to spend it maintaining their old farmhouse, and he didn't want to get a new dog, even though Amy always wanted one. He wanted to travel more than she did. He claims the argument escalated quickly. He says he took his service weapon out of its holster and set it down on the dining room hutch because he needed to use the bathroom. When he came out, he says Amy was standing there, gun raised to the right side of her own head. He says she told him something like, "You don't want me around," and that he lunged to stop her but wasn't fast enough. She was, in his words, too quick. At the very end of that first interview, as he's handing his phone over for data extraction, Brian says something that stops the detective cold. "You're going to see some things on there, and it's not what it appears to be." For an experienced investigator, an unprompted statement like that isn't reassurance. It's a red flag being planted before anyone even asked the question. And once the digital forensics team gets into his devices, that flag becomes a trail, and the trail goes back months. In late February and early March, Brian is repeatedly searching a name, Corrine Knowles, known as Corey. By early April, his searches shift. He wants to know if he can have an affair without physical sex. 2 weeks later, he's deep into Massachusetts divorce law, specifically fixated on one question: what happens to a police officer's pension in a divorce? That pension mattered enormously to a man close to retirement, and investigators would later learn he'd told Corrine directly that he was afraid of losing part of it. Just 11 days before Amy's death, he searches how to delete the frequently contacted list on his phone. Not a full wipe, just enough to erase the people he called most. And on the morning of May 8th itself, while sitting at his desk at the police station, Brian searches the Massachusetts Medical Examiner's office and looks up information on forensic units, the teams that respond when someone dies and piece together exactly what happened. He leaves the station at 11:47 a.m. By lunchtime, his wife is dead. Prosecutors argued there was a very specific reason for timing. Brian didn't want detectives digging into how much contact he'd actually had with Corrine Knowles. As Assistant DA Mary Sandstrom put it, all of these incriminating searches begin the moment the affair starts. This wasn't a man losing control in a moment of passion. This was a man doing his homework, step by step. And that's really the disturbing core of this case. Brian Fanion wasn't just a husband. He was a detective who understood exactly how murder investigations unfold, because he'd spent decades running them himself. He knew what forensic examiners look for. He knew what digital evidence could reveal. He studied the very tools that would eventually be used against him, and he still believed he could outsmart them. That's not the thinking of a grieving husband. That's the thinking of a man who believed the system he'd spent 30 years working inside could be managed, controlled, and beaten. He was almost right. Amy's wake is held on May 14th. Just 3 days later, Brian is brought back in for a second interview. But this time, everything is different. He's read his Miranda rights, and he immediately picks up on the shift. "So, I'm not under arrest or anything?" he asks. Notice what that question reveals. Not concern about the investigation. Not a question about Amy. Just an instant read on what the change in procedure means for him. This time, detectives have the forensic results. They have his phone data. They have a photo of Corrine Knowles. And they have a very specific problem with his story. The gunshot wound shows no gunshot residue. In a close-range self-inflicted wound, you'd expect stippling and residue on the skin from a muzzle blast. Amy had none. To Detective Owl, that simply wasn't consistent with a self-inflicted shot. Brian sticks to his story anyway. That same afternoon, across town, detectives sit down with Corrine Knowles herself. Brian had described her to investigators as just a friend. But the deleted text messages recovered from his phone tell an entirely different story. Thousands of messages between the two of them, revealing a relationship that was clearly far more than friendship. And in one of the most chilling details of the entire case, at 12:47 p.m. on May 8th, while Amy lay dead on the dining room floor, while first responders were still inside the house, Brian texted Corrine, "Please don't call or text for a while. I'll call when I can. Really bad. Pray for my family, please." His wife had been dead for minutes, and he was already managing the narrative. It takes 18 months of careful, methodical investigation before Brian Fanion is formally charged with murder in November 2019. The next day, in Hampton Superior Court, he pleads not guilty. The courtroom is packed, and according to reporters who were there, the atmosphere is one of pure shock, not just because of the charge, but because of who's sitting behind Brian. Amy's own family, relatives and in-laws who genuinely believe Brian was innocent, that Amy truly had taken her own life, and that the entire prosecution was a terrible mistake. It's an almost unheard of scene. A murder victim's own family publicly supporting the man accused of killing her. The trial finally begins in February 2023, nearly 5 years after Amy's death. The prosecution's very first witness is Amy's sister, Anna Hansen, who testifies that weeks after Amy died, Brian told her directly that he'd been worried about an internet search he'd made. When she asked what it was, he told her how to make a murder look like a suicide. Those were, she insists, his exact words. On cross-examination, the defense points out that forensic examiners never actually found that specific phrase on any of Brian's devices, but the statement itself is now part of the record, spoken directly from Brian to his sister-in-law. Over the following weeks, prosecutors called more than 40 witnesses across 2 full weeks of testimony, laying out the digital timeline, the forensic evidence, the affair, and the financial motive tied to his pension. The defense, meanwhile, argues that Amy had a difficult emotional history, citing anxiety and mood swings referenced in her own diary. Their forensic expert testifies that Amy's thick hair could theoretically have blocked gunshot residue from ever reaching her skin. In closing arguments, the defense claims Amy raised a gun in a moment of rage and effectively caused her own death. But prosecutor Mary Sandstrom lays the full timeline out for the jury one more time. The searches about the affair in March, the divorce and pension searches in April, videos about gunshot residue in late April, and finally, the searches about the medical examiner's office on the very morning of the murder, followed by Brian leaving the police department at 11:47 a.m. He was researching, she argued, the very people who would come looking into his wife's death before he had even killed her. The jury received the case on March 21st, 2023. They deliberate for less than 2 days. On March 22nd, the verdict comes back, guilty of first-degree murder. That same afternoon, Brian Fanion is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Hampton district attorney later released a statement calling Brian's actions calculating and shockingly cruel, praising the jury for seeing to the defense and holding him accountable. Brian's own attorney, in contrast, stood before the judge and insisted the jury had gotten it wrong, that anyone who truly knew Brian Fanion knew he hadn't done this. And in the courtroom, people who had believed in him completely for years simply broke down. What makes this case so difficult to sit with isn't only the murder itself, it's the layers of betrayal stacked on top of it. Brian Fanion used 3 decades of law enforcement training not to protect his community, but to try to engineer the perfect crime. He researched the forensic techniques that would eventually be used against him. He studied the very investigators who would come knocking. And when they did come, he sat across from his own colleagues, in a room he knew intimately, and performed grief with the same careful precision he'd applied to everything else. The verdict itself wasn't hard for the jury to reach. What lingers is a harder question. How many people who worked beside Brian Fanion for years, who trusted him as a colleague and a friend, will ever fully unlearn that version of him? Some of them, honestly, may never get there completely. That's not naivety. That's simply what happens when someone corrupts a trust that deep. Amy's children, Tori and Travis, still live in Westfield today, raising their own families. They stood by their father throughout the trial and continue to carry something that no legal outcome can fully resolve. They lost both parents in a single afternoon, their mother to violence, their father to the truth of what he turned out to be. Brian Fanion wasn't just a husband who killed his wife. He was a representative of the very institution his community trusted most, the one that's supposed to show up when everything goes wrong. He used that trust twice, once in his own dining room, and once in an interview room with his own colleagues. And what a case like this leaves behind in a town like Westfield isn't just grief. It's a quieter, harder kind of awareness, a reminder that a badge, a title, or decades of service never guarantee anything about the person underneath them. Amy Jean Hansen Fanion was 51 years old. She was healthy, happy, and full of life, building a future she had no idea was about to be taken from her. The man responsible for that is now spending the rest of his life behind bars. If this story stayed with you, that's exactly the point. Amy's name deserves to be said, and said correctly. Thanks for watching.